The roast was dry again. My mother always overcooked it when we had guests, as if crisp edges suggested competence. The dining room smelled faintly of rosemary and lemon polish. The chandelier above the table cast a soft yellow light that made everyone look warmer than they actually were. "Let's make a toast," my father said, standing at the head of the table with his wine glass lifted. Richard Marlowe never missed an opportunity to perform. He cleared his throat, glanced toward our neighbors, the Caldwells, and smiled. "To Lauren and Paul," he began, nodding toward my sister and her husband, "for locking in their second mortgage before rates went up. Smart planning." Lauren beamed. "We just didn't want to wait," she said modestly. And to Elenaâ, he added, turning toward me with a grin that never reached his eyes. "Still renting at 3rd floor. Taking her and figuring things out." The table laughed politely. I felt the wobble before I saw it. The glass hurricane's centerpiece in the middle of the table tilted slightly when my father set his glass down to hearth. My mother steadied it quickly with manicured fingers. "Just exploring her options," Diane said, her tone light, almost indulgent. Elenaâ's always been unconventional. Unconventional was the family word for disappointing. I folded my napkin once more in my lap and smiled the way it practiced for years, closed lips, minimal teeth. It was easier to let it pass than to correct it. Across from me, Lauren leaned forward. "It's just nice to feel stable," she said. "Owning something. You know?" I did know. I knew exactly how stability felt when it was recorded with a county clerk and secured with a brass key. My father cut into his roast and continued. "Speaking of ownership, my duplex in Norwalk is finally paying off. Got a great tenant in there. Reliable guy. Pays early?" He looked around the table as if expecting applause. "Thomas Grayson," he added. "Hardworking. Respectful. You can tell when someone understands responsibility." I took a sip of water. Harbor Line Property Holdings had purchased that duplex 3 years ago through a quiet foreclosure auction. The deed was filed in Fairfield County under my LLC's name. Thomas Grace, a nest lease agreement bore my signature at the bottom. My father had never noticed. The centerpiece wobbled again when Lauren reached for the salt. "Some people just need more time," my mother said, glancing at me. "Not everyone is meant to settle down." There was a rhythm to it. The joke. The sigh. The implication that I was suspended somewhere between adolescence and adulthood. I watched my father describe his investment in detail, unaware that the property taxes, the maintenance invoices, and the insurance policies were processed through my accounts. He thought I was drifting. I thought about how long I'd been letting them think that. The roast knife scraped against porcelain. Laughter filled the small pauses. This wasn't the first time I had been introduced as the renter. It was simply the first time I had decided to bring the folder. "My name is Elena Marlowe, and in my family, renting meant unstable." Financial comparison turned into identity before I even understood money. If you've ever been labeled unstable, tell me what word they used. This story isn't loud. It's about documentation. And it started long before leases. In our house, stability was something you could photograph. It had granite countertops and matching dining chairs. It came with a 30-year mortgage and a lawn edged with precision. My father, Richard Marlowe, treated property ownership like a moral achievement. He read real estate listings the way other men read sports scores, nodding approvingly at square footage and resale value. "Man doesn't lie," he used to say. "You can't argue with ownership." My mother, Diane, had her own version of the same belief. To her, stability meant marriage before 30, joint accounts, and a Christmas card that looked coordinated. She liked phrases like "settled down on safe choices." She used them often, usually in the same breath as my sister's name. Lauren married Paul at 26. By 28, they had purchased a colonial-style home in Westport with pale shutters and a two-car garage. At every Sunday dinner, updates were given like quarterly reports. "We refinanced at a lower rate," Lauren would say, smiling into her wine glass. Richard would nod approvingly. That's how you build equity. Then someone would glance at me. And how's the apartment? Diane would ask, tilting her head in what she thought was kindness. My apartment in Stamford was tidy and sunlit, with hardwood floors and the view of the train line. I liked it. I chose it. But at that table, it became shorthand for failure. You're still renting? A neighbor once asked at dinner, surprised. At your age? I would smile and say yes. I didn't elaborate, because elaboration invites interrogation. Outwardly, my parents were supportive. They praised my degree in finance. They told friends I worked in investments, but privately, they positioned me as the cautionary tale, the one who hadn't committed, the one still figuring it out. There's a specific tone families use when they disguise comparison as encouragement. You're so smart, Diane would say. You'll find your way eventually. Eventually. As if I were behind schedule on a timeline they had drawn without consulting me. What they didn't know was that I had been studying foreclosure auctions on my lunch breaks. That I had met with a small lender at Harbor Line Capital to discuss LLC structuring. That at 27, I signed papers in a quiet office and walked out with a brass key to a duplex in Norwalk. I didn't announce it. I didn't bring a bottle of champagne to Sunday dinner. I listened to them describe stability while holding the weight of something they couldn't see. Because sometimes the safest way to build is quietly. And I had decided I would let them underestimate me for as long as it served me. The first property didn't look impressive from the outside. It was a narrow, two-story duplex in Norwalk with faded siding and a mailbox that leaned slightly to the left. The lawn needed trimming. The paint around the window frames had chipped. My father would have called it a project. I called it leverage. I signed the closing documents at Harbor Line Capital on a Tuesday afternoon. The office smelled faintly of printer ink and carpet cleaner. The attorney slid the papers across the table, and I signed my name where the tabs indicated, steady and deliberate. Harbor Line Property Holdings, LLC. I had formed the company 6 months earlier, quietly, between conference calls and late dinners. No one in my family knew. No one had been consulted. When the brass key was placed in my palm, it felt heavier than I expected. Solid. Functional. Real. I didn't cry. I didn't call anyone. I drove back to Stamford, parked outside my apartment, and sat in the car for a few minutes with the key resting against my thigh. Ownership doesn't always need applause. I kept the documents in a leather folder inside the bottom drawer of my desk. Property deed. Insurance policy. Lease agreement template. Every receipt filed carefully. Every signature scanned and backed up. At Sunday dinner that week, the brass key rested in my purse beneath my napkin. Still renting? My father asked casually, carving roast chicken as if the question were routine. Yes, I said, smiling. The truth sat quietly against my lipstick tube and car keys. I didn't correct him. I didn't explain that my tenant had already paid first month's rent and security deposit. I didn't mention the mortgage amortization schedule I had reviewed the night before, because explanation would have turned it into debate. And debate was their arena. 3 months later, I purchased a second property, a small condo in Bridgeport. By through Tito, there were 3. One of them, in fact, had passed briefly through a partnership my father believed he controlled, a deal he bragged about often. He never read the fine print carefully enough to notice when the ownership shifted through a foreclosure acquisition. I did. At dinner, the centerpiece wobbled again when he spoke about his investment portfolio. The brass key pressed lightly against my purse lining. They thought I was drifting. They didn't know I was building. And as the jokes grew sharper, so did my patience. By the 3rd Sunday in a row, I realized it was accidental. It was choreography. Diane would begin with something bright and harmless. Lauren's kitchen remodel is almost done, should say, passing the mashed potatoes. Quartz countertops this time. It's such an investment. Lauren would nod modestly, describing backsplashed aisles and cabinet hardware as if narrating a lifestyle upgrade. Then Richard would glance at me. Elenaâ still renting, HED add lightly, carving into the roast. Different priorities. The table would laugh softly, not unkindly, just habitually. I learned to anticipate it the way some people anticipate weather changes. My shoulders would tense slightly before dessert. I would take a sip of water to buy myself a second. There's a specific exhaustion that comes from correcting a lie you know they won't accept. If I said I preferred liquidity, they would call it fear. If I mentioned diversified holdings, they would call it theory. If I said nothing, they would interpret it as confirmation. So, I chose silence. It was efficient. The Caldwells came twice that month. Richard introduced me to them as our daughter, the renter. He smiled as if the label were affectionate, a family quirk. Smart girl, mister, Caldwell said, clapping my shoulder. But ownership changes you. I almost laughed. Ownership had already changed me. It had simply done so quietly. The centerpiece wobbled again when Richard set down his glass too hard. Diane studied it with 2 fingers, pretending not to notice the instability. Lauren leaned toward me once and whispered, "You know Dad doesn't mean it." Intent is oft uncited as absolution. The week after Thanksgiving, I reviewed Harbor Line Property Holdings' quarterly reports at my kitchen table. Among the standard rent payments on maintenance expenses was a notification lease extension signed. Tenant Thomas Grayson. Property 214 Maple Street, Norwalk. Signed and executed for another 2 years. I paused, reading the address again. 214 Maple Street was the duplex my father had once bragged about taking control of during a partnership restructuring. The same property he referenced at dinner as proof of his investment instincts. The lease extension bore my company's letterhead. Thomas Grayson had signed directly with Harbor Line Property Holdings LLC. My father had no idea. I closed the file and leaned back in my chair. At Sunday dinner that week, Richard described Thomas as loyal and good at recognizing a fair landlord. I watched him speak, steady and assured. The math had already shifted. He just hadn't looked at the ledger yet. The confirmation came in an email at 7:42 a.m., before the city had fully woken up. Subject line lease renewal 214 Maple Street. I was sitting at my kitchen counter in Stamford, barefoot, coffee cooling beside my laptop. Harbor Line Property Holdings portal was open, the dashboard familiar and orderly. I clicked the attachment without urgency. Tenant Thomas Grayson. Term to year extension. Landlord Harbor Line Property Holdings LLC. Authorized signature Elena Marlowe. My name. The address sat there calmly in black ink. 214 Maple Street, Norwalk. For years, my father had referred to that duplex as his side income property. He liked the phrase. It sounded disciplined, entrepreneurial. He told neighbors he had negotiated the purchase himself after a complicated partnership dispute. What he never mentioned was that the property had entered foreclosure 6 months later. And what he never noticed was that I had purchased it quietly at auction through my LLC, after reviewing the filings on a lunch break and recognizing the opportunity. I remember the day I signed those papers. The courthouse hallway smelled faintly of dust and toner. The foreclosure docket had been thinly attended. No dramatic bidding war. No family rivalry. Just numbers, paperwork, and a closing statement I read twice before signing. Ownership transferred cleanly. I didn't announce it. I didn't call my father. I let him continue believing he had retained control, because legally on paper he hadn't. Now Thomas Grayson's renewal confirmed what I already knew but hadn't needed to confront. My father's tenant was mine. I pulled up the county registry records for Fairfield County again, even though it reviewed them dozens of times before. Deed transfer recorded under Harbor Line Property Holdings LLC. Date stamped. Filed. Indexed. Everything precise. Everything unambiguous. For a moment, I sat very still. It was triumph that I felt. It was clarity. For years, I had allowed the dinner table narrative to run uninterrupted. I had listened to Richard describe equity and stability as though I were absent from both. I had accepted the label because correcting it would have required a different kind of confrontation. But the lease in front of me wasn't theoretical. It was active. The next Sunday dinner was already scheduled. Diane had texted earlier that we crossed at 6. Don't be late. I closed my laptop and glanced toward the leather folder resting inside my desk drawer. Inside were copies of the deed, the mortgage statements, the lease agreements, paper heavier than accusation, dates stronger than memory. The wobbling centerpiece would be waiting. So would the roast. I reached into my purse and touched the brass key, cool and solid against my fingertips. This time, I would bring the folder. And this time, I wouldn't correct them with words. I would correct them with documentation. I arrived 5 minutes early. The leather folder sat flat against the inside of my bag, heavier than its contents warranted. The brass key rested in my coat pocket, pressing gently against my thigh as I stepped up to my parents' front door. Inside, the house smelled like rosemary and lemon polish. Diane greeted me with a quick kiss on the cheek. "You look tired," she said, as if offering concern. The dining table was already set. The Hurricane's centerpiece stood in the middle, glass cylinder slightly crooked, candle leaning off center. I straightened my napkin and sat down without comment. Richard carved the roast with exaggerated precision, narrating small updates before anyone asked. "Thomas signed another extension," he said casually, slicing into the meat. 2 more years. Reliable tenant. That duplex has been one of my smarter moves." Laura nodded approvingly. Stability matters. It was a ritual. The roast. The comment. The subtle glance in my direction. Still renting. The room implied. I felt the folder shift lightly when I crossed my legs beneath the table. My pulse was steady. My shoulders relaxed. I had practiced this in the car. Not what I would say exactly, but how I would breathe while saying it. If you've ever rehearsed calm responses in the car before walking into dinner, you know this moment. The silence before the first comment. The way your body anticipates dismissal. Richard raised his glass. "Some people understand ownership," he said, smiling. "Others are still figuring it out." The centerpiece wobbled when he set the glass down. I reached into my bag. The leather made a quiet sound as I placed the folder on the table between the salt shaker and the roast platter. The room didn't react at first. It rarely did. But something in my posture had shifted. I rested my hand lightly on the folder's edge and looked directly at my father. "You're right," I said calmly. "Some people do understand ownership." The room went still in a way it hadn't before. This was no longer rehearsal. It was time to turn the page. Richard didn't notice the folder at first. He was mid-sentence, describing Thomas Grayson as if loyalty were a character trait he had personally instilled. "You can always tell when a tenant respects you," he said, carving another slice. "Thomas understands the value of paying early." Lauren smiled. Diane adjusted the napkins. I opened the folder. The paper made a soft, deliberate sound against the table. Not loud enough to interrupt, but distinct enough to register. "Thomas Grayson does pay early," I said evenly. My father glanced up, amused. "Oh? You've met him?" "Yes." I slid the lease agreement across the table toward him. Silence didn't fall immediately. It gathered. Richard picked up the document with mild irritation, as though indulging a tangent. His eyes skimmed the header first. "Harborline Property Holdings LLC." He frowned. "What is this?" he asked. "It's Thomas Grayson Nest lease renewal," I replied. 2-year extension. Signed last week. Diane laughed lightly. "Elenaâ works in finance. I'm sure she's just analyzing it." I kept my hands folded in my lap. Thomas Grayson, I continued, is my tenant. The sentence did not rise in volume. It didn't need to. The room shifted. Richard's eyes moved back to the top of the page, then down to the signature block. Landlord Harbor Line Property Holdings LLC. Authorized signature Elena Marlowe. His fingers tightened around the paper. That's not possible, Diane said quickly. Your father owns that duplex. I reached into the folder again and removed a second document. Fairfield County Registry of Deeds. Property 214 Maple Street, Norwalk. Current owner Harbor Line Property Holdings LLC. I placed it beside the lease. Richard's hand trembled as he lifted the registry document closer to his face. The tremor was small but unmistakable, traveling from his knuckles into his wrist. This is incorrect, he said, but the certainty had thinned. It was foreclosed 3 years ago, I replied calmly. I purchased it at auction. The deed transfer was recorded 2 days later. Lauren looked from him to me, confused. Dad, is that true? Richard swallowed. The centerpiece wobbled again when his elbow brushed the table. Diane's voice sharpened. Why would you do something like that without telling us? I met her gaze. Because every time I told you something, I said, you told me I was unstable. Silence expanded until it pressed against the walls. Richard lowered the document slowly. Yuri saying he began, then stopped. I'm saying Thomas Grayson has been paying me, I finished. He set the paper down carefully, as if it might shatter. For years he had narrated my life as if it were a cautionary tale. Now he was reading it in ink. You went behind my back, he said finally. I went through the registry, I corrected. There is a difference. Diane opened her mouth to pivot the narrative perhaps toward betrayal, perhaps toward secrecy, but I reached back into the folder once more. There's more, I said gently. I slid 2 additional property summaries across the table. Bridgeport, Stamford, both under Harbor Line Property Holdings. I own 3, I added. The room did not laugh this time. Richard stared at the stack of documents, hands still unsteady. For the first time in my life, I wasn't correcting a joke. I was correcting a record. And records don't require applause. The silence didn't last long. It rarely does when power shifts. Lauren was the first to recover. This is unbelievable, she said, pushing her chair back slightly. You let Dad think he owned that place. I let him speak, I replied. Diane's expression hardened. You went behind your father's back, she said, voice sharpening into something almost triumphant. You deceived us. The word hung in the air. Deceived. For years, I had sat at that table and listened to them narrate my life as instability. I had absorbed jokes that calcified into identity. I had corrected nothing because correction had never been the point. But now secrecy was betrayal. Contrast reveals more than confrontation ever could. I purchased a property through a public auction, I said evenly. The records were filed with the county. Nothing was hidden. Richard hadn't spoken yet. He stared at the papers as if they were written in another language. You should have told us, Diane insisted. I did tell you things, I said softly. You just decided what they meant. Lauren folded her arms. So what? This is some kind of revenge. You wait years to embarrass Dad? Embarrassment. I looked at the wobbling centerpiece between us. I didn't embarrass him, I said. I clarified ownership. When they lose the narrative, they call you cruel. Richard finally spoke, his voice low. You made me look foolish. I met his gaze. You made me look unstable, I answered. The difference is one of repetition. Diane's eyes flashed. We were encouraging you. By introducing me as the renter? I asked gently. Lauren looked away first. There is a moment in any confrontation when the script no longer fits. When the old lines fall flat and the room waits for something else to happen. Richard's anger had nowhere to land. The documents lay between us, calm and unmoving. Paper does not argue. It simply exists. For years, their version of me required my participation. It required my silence, my laughter, my acceptance of the joke. Now the narrative had collapsed under its own weight. And in the quiet that followed, I realized something important. Correction was only the first step. Boundaries would have to follow. No one raised their voice. That was the part that surprised me. Richard sat back slowly, the tremor in his hands fading into something heavier. Diane's posture stiffened, but her expression no longer carried the easy authority it once had. Lauren stared at the documents as if they might rearrange themselves if she waited long enough. I gathered the papers carefully and returned them to the leather folder. "You don't get to call me unstable again," I said calmly. It wasn't a threat. It wasn't dramatic. It was simply a statement. Diane exhaled sharply. "Elenaâ." "No," I interrupted gently. "For years, that word has been repeated like fact. It isn't. I won't sit at this table and let it be." Richard's jaw tightened. "You're overreacting." "I'm clarifying," I replied. The room had shifted into something quieter now. The roast cooled on the serving platter. The centerpiece leaned again, unsteady. "I don't need you to approve of how I build my life," I continued. "But if I'm going to keep showing up here, the jokes stop. The comparisons stop. Or I don't come." Lauren blinked. "So you're threatening to cut us off?" "I'm choosing not to be misrepresented," I said. "There is a difference." Silence filled the space where Sunday rituals usually live. For a long time, I had believed that attendance equaled loyalty, that enduring the remarks was proof of maturity. But endurance is not the same as consent. Richard looked toward the front hallway, where the bowl of spare house skis sat on the narrow console table. Mine had been there for years, a small silver key I rarely used. After dinner, while Diane cleared plates in brittle quiet and Lauren whispered to her husband in the kitchen, I walked to the hallway. The key rested where it always had. I lifted it from the bowl and slipped it into my purse. No announcement. No explanation. Just removal. When I returned to the dining room, Richard watched me with a confusion that bordered on recognition. "We'll talk later," Diane said stiffly. "Maybe," I replied. "But clarity doesn't require follow-up." As I stepped outside into the cool evening air, I realized something steady had replaced the wobble. For the first time, I was leaving dinner diminished. I was leaving it defined. My building in Stamford doesn't look impressive from the street. There's no manicured lawn. No chandelier visible through oversized windows. Just brick, clean lines, and a door that opens when I choose to unlock it. The brass key slid easily into the lock. The click was soft but certain. Inside, the hallway light turned on automatically. No one commented on my timing. No one evaluated my posture. The air smelled faintly of detergent and something warm from the apartment below. I stepped into my unit and set the leather folder on the kitchen counter. The dining table stood steady in the center of the room. No wobble. No need to adjust the legs before sitting down. I ran my palm across its surface, smooth and solid beneath my hand. For years, stability had been described to me as something visible to others' curb appeal, square footage, resale value. But stability feels different when you're the one holding the deed. I placed the brass key on the counter and looked at it for a moment. Not as proof. Not as a weapon. Just as fact. I thought about the house key I had removed from my parents' hallway bowl. How light it had felt in my hand. Access is quiet power. I opened the window slightly and let the evening air move through the room. There were no raised voices here. No ritualized comparisons. Just space. I sat down at my table and exhaled. For the first time, dinner had not ended with me absorbing the weight of someone else's narrative. It had ended with clarity. And clarity, I was beginning to understand, doesn't require applause. It requires a door you can close. I reached for my phone and turned it face down. Tonight, no one entered the space unless I invited them. That was not rebellion. It was choice. And for me, that was enough. For years, I thought the argument was about rent, about leases versus mortgages, about timing, about adulthood measured in property taxes. It was. Renting was never the issue. Control was. When someone repeats a label often enough unstable, behind, still figuring it out, it stops being commentary and starts becoming containment. It narrows the way you move. It teaches you to preemptively shrink, to justify your choices before they're questioned. I didn't buy property to prove anything to my parents. I bought it because I understood leverage. I stayed quiet not because I was ashamed, but because timing matters. Because documentation speaks more clearly than a bait. Because correction without structure turns into noise. At that dinner table, they thought I was reacting. I was. I was concluding. There's a difference between winning an argument and removing yourself from one entirely. When my father's hands trembled over the lease, I didn't feel vindicated. I felt aligned. The truth had weight, and for once, it wasn't resting on my shoulders alone. If someone once measured your worth in square footage, income brackets, or marital status, I hope you're measuring it differently now. I hope you're measuring it in steadiness, in autonomy, in how quietly you can close a door without slamming it. This story isn't about humiliation reversed. It's about narrative reclaimed. It's about understanding that stability isn't something announced over roast dinners. It's something built in silence, reinforced with intention, and protected with boundaries. If this felt familiar, if you sat at a table where you were introduced as less, tell me in the comments what they called you. And tell me what you call yourself now. Sometimes saying it out loud changes the ledger. And if you do like more stories like this, calm, steady, rooted in truth, stay with me. There's more to document.